So we'll jump off with the exam first thing on Monday morning. There will be 40 multiple choice questions, 10 per chapter. You will have seen questions very similar to these in the quizzes that you've been taking. Remember that you can have a one-page, 8.5 by 11 size piece of paper with notes written on it. You cannot reproduce my slides, reproduce test banks, or anything like that. I don't mind if you type it. I just don't want you to just print out in microfiche form the test bank or my slides to use as your study cheat sheet. You'll have 60 minutes to complete the exam. Most people don't take anywhere near that long. And we'll be taking it on the computer in our classroom. So let's get started. On this slide, I would make sure that I remember the definition of above average returns. Remember that performance is ultimately what we're worried about in strategy, and it is the outcome of the strategic management process. Remember the discussion about position, trade-off, and fit. There will be one question having to do with that other view of strategy. Hypercompetition is important. Remember what causes it and the impact of that. And then there are several questions they're going to ask you to compare and contrast the IO view of strategy with the resource-based view of strategy. So make sure you're familiar with both of those. Talk about what is the difference between a vision and mission statement. And there are two questions on stakeholders. So know who are in the various groups, what they're interested in, and how strategic leaders sometimes have to juggle between them. And that's it for Chapter 1. For Chapter 2, there's two questions on the general environment, and you're going to need to know basically what goes in these different categories and be able to apply that. There are just a lot of questions on Porter's 5 forces. Make sure that you know why people choose not to enter. New entrants don't tend to enter, barriers to entry and expected retaliation. You need to understand all of these concepts in this course. Some of these definitions or some of the understanding what is in part of that are the basis for a couple of the test questions. Nothing specifically off of this slide or of this slide, but I think you're going to, if you understand the concepts, it will help you in general answer the questions. There are a couple of different questions on rivalry among competitors, and that's why I think I said understanding the concepts in the previous slides are important, because many of these are similar concepts. Don't forget the complementors, just like I say on the slide. Understand who they are and why they're important. In terms of strategic groups, there's one question on strategic groups, how you identify them and the use of that concept. And there is a question about ethical competitor intelligence. And those are the topics in Chapter 2 you need to make sure you understand. On to Chapter 3. Again, I told you the questions are actually in the Chapter 2 part, but you're going to need to make sure you understand the difference between the IO and the resource-based view of the firm and what's unique to each of those concepts. No questions specifically off of this. I don't think I've got a question where I ask you to define customer value. I should have probably, but the idea of this of characteristics and attributes willing to pay is so important that when you understand that, it's going to help you get other questions correct. I spent a lot of time talking about uncertainty and complexity. Make sure you understand those, and make sure you also understand that people get this wrong in that they sometimes have cognitive biases that lead them to make bad decisions, particularly in the case of uncertainty and complexity. Resources, you need to be able to know what's a tangible, what's an intangible, but more than that, you're going to need to be able to apply what's special about each of them. This little chart here, knowing that and knowing these 4 qualities and being able to apply them are key to about 2 or 3 or 4 questions. So make sure you're all over that. Also, even though I talk about lack of, or how the old model doesn't have substitute, even though I talked about here where the author that created the model doesn't use substitutability anymore, there is a substitutable question there because, again, to me, that's similar to imitability, so I want you to be able to identify what substitution is. Value chain, it's important to understand this because it is a big part of several questions in the Chapter 4 questions, but the idea of when to outsource and when not to outsource is important to a question. And then understanding how we use this idea of matching strengths and weaknesses is key to the strategic process, is key, but also understanding the idea of rigidity, that sometimes when you stick to your strengths for too long, it's a problem, will help you on the exam. Okay, that's it for Chapter 3. Lastly, Chapter 4, hopefully you've already watched those videos. If not, I'm not going to give away too much. This is an important slide to know what is the beginning of a strategy. No definition off of here. This is an important slide to understand what is the source of, I don't want to say differentiation because that's a strategy, but how we position ourselves differently. And then I cover the cost leadership, the focus, and the differentiation strategy. In addition to the integrated cost leadership strategy, there's questions about all of them. And those questions tend to talk about it's important to know what kind of product a cost leader produces. It's important to know the trade-offs and what in the value chain tends to create the greatest advantage for a cost leader. It's important to be able to apply why this is a strong position and how people might respond to challenges when they're using a cost leader strategy. And I can say the same thing for differentiation. What trade-offs are involved, what it looks like when you have them, and how it affects you in conjunction with Porter's 5 forces. There are a lot of application questions that they go off of these sorts of concepts. For the focus strategies, be able to recognize when a company is applying a focus strategy. I didn't talk about in the presentation whether it was focused cost leadership or focused differentiation. The test question will be obvious which of them it applies to. And also the integrated strategy, be able to recognize a company that is employing that. If you know these concepts, you are going to do perfectly well on the exam. I will see you Monday morning.